And then I wanted to say April marks a very special month for our club. This Earth Day, April 22nd, is the 50th anniversary since our amazing founder, Jan Smith, had her first club meeting in her home back in 1971. Jan has before and since then continued to work for a healthier and more beautiful environment. And Jan started using organic and environment-friendly methods of gardening in her own yard. And then she began volunteering in the community and beyond, serving on a number of committees working for environmental education and involvement on issues such as saving open space, restricting pesticides, recycling, and reducing carbon emissions. So we think that this is the perfect time to honor all of the amazing things she has done for our environment and our community. So now I'm going to give this over to Jan to speak.
You have to unmute yourself, Jan. There should be a little tab down on the bottom part of your screen at the far left. There you go.
There we are. Thank you, Wendy. Hello and welcome to all the people who are here to enjoy the hummingbirds and celebrate our 50th anniversary. I just want to I see Jean Baylog is here, and I believe she attended the very first meeting at my house. Is that right? Well, she's muted. I just want to share a little background of the club and acknowledge the person who inspired me to become active in protecting our beautiful earth, Rachel Carson, the author of Silent Spring. I read her book back in the last century in the mid-60s, 1960s. And here's a quote from the Boston Herald. The thing to remember is that the author is not an alarmist, but a trained, meticulously scrupulous scientist who shuns publicity and controversy, but whose findings were too catastrophic to keep to herself. And I actually painted a picture of her. I'll show you my artwork. I don't know if it'll show up too well, but she's in the woods with her birding book and her binoculars and bird watching. So Dennis, I think you like that.
Absolutely.
And I still have the book, Silent Spring, a little paperback, and it was 75 cents. It's a treasure. So, well, her book tells of a spring that was silent, no birds singing, and many dead birds laying around. She knew something was terribly wrong. She was ridiculed by the bigwigs of the chemical companies. In that day and culture, the chemical purveyors were considered the experts, but they were promoting their companies that produced the chemicals and the poisons. She was a real scientist. Bucking the system isn't easy. It was the same for organic gardening back in the 60s and 70s. For example, the cooperative extension of the University of Illinois, which now has a good master gardener, such as our own Gail Sanders. Are you here, Gail? Anyway, the new ones some of them embrace the organic methods, but back then, the extension would not allow their master gardeners to say anything about organic gardening. In fact, we had a member of our club who was so good and had so much wonderful knowledge, and she took the whole master gardener's course and she wanted to share her knowledge, and they would not let her, so she quit. So our club was a haven for those who wanted to garden without poisons to raise healthy foods for our families. We held the programs in our different homes, starting with mine and taking turns, and also in our gardens. And we this is the way we would do it. We didn't have speakers at first. We didn't have money or anything. It was totally a democratic, you do it yourself. Everyone was equally a part of it. And we would go around the room. We'd ask people to bring either a tip for the season of the meeting or a question. And we would take turns, and sometimes we'd have a timekeeper so someone wouldn't hog the whole evening, but we got everybody in so everyone would have a chance to say their tip or their question. And if they had a question, then other people would have ideas to answer that question. So we'd have an interchange, and it was really brought out a lot of information that way. Sometimes we shared information about something that we had observed in our own gardens, and it may not even be something that was ever written in a book. So, but we also read a lot of the Rodale Organic Gardening books, and I still have 2 of them. One has a butterfly weed on the top, on the cover, and the other one has good old soil. I don't know, let's see, can you see it? But it says, soil is better than gold. And I just want to say, people call it dirt, and really you shouldn't soil is not dirt. Soil is a whole ecosystem. If you do it organically, soil has compost in it, the decaying particles of plants, and it also has earthworms and many microorganisms that are alive, and that's what a healthy soil is. A dead soil may be dead because too many chemicals were put on it to fertilize it. Anyway, now more and more people are going organic. So in 50 years, a lot has changed. And it's really a pleasure to me to see the people that more and more people are interested in organic, and they even have organic products in the stores to buy for food. But it's always best to have the fresh out of your garden if you can. But back then, DDT was the mosquito spray that was used in Carroll Stream. And DDT was banned in the early 70s. But we have other challenges now. Today, a challenge is that we have seeds that are treated with neonicotinoids. I said it. I like to say neonics. That's a lot shorter and easier. And the seed is poison, and the whole plant is poison. And it can affect it's supposed to keep the insects from eating it, but it can affect the pollinators. If they get the pollen, it can weaken the pollinators or even make them die. So and these are very widely used now. So that's something to watch out for, and we have talked about it before. This is interesting. Of all the insect species in the world, and I read this in the encyclopedia many years ago, only 1% to 2% are detrimental to human activities or human purposes. And that means, that's species, not individual insects, but species. But that means that there's 98 to 99% of all the insect species that are beneficial as part of the food web and the balance of nature. Some insects eat other insects, and a lot of insects are bird food, and that's a really important part of the insect world. The sprays are harmful to birds also, and amphibians and other life, and even to us. Some of us believe it may be a factor in, does everyone have someone in their family and friends that has cancer? I think that it's so prevalent, and it just makes you wonder. But we need to learn about and appreciate the whole web of life, or the whole interaction of all the things in nature in our gardens. And the more you learn, the more exciting it is to see that. As gardeners, we are more aware of the big challenges in the weather and the climate. We care about the delicate life system of this special planet Earth. And I want to thank you, Laura, and the Carroll Stream Public Library for partnering with the club. It has really helped us grow and help educate ourselves and others. And I want to thank all the members of our club who help to keep the club healthy and going. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jan. And if anyone would want to send Jan a congratulations or a comment, I'm going to leave a couple of links in the chat where you can do this. So now I would like to introduce our speaker for the evening. Denis Kania is a director on the board of the DuPage Birding Club, and he has been birding for a very long time, and he has traveled extensively looking for birds around the world and is going to talk to us today about hummingbirds and attracting them to our yards.
Well, thank you very much, Jan. That was a great introduction to what all of us should be thinking about, because it is all so very important. And so happy anniversary. I'm going to share a screen so that we can start talking about hummingbirds here. And there we go. So there we go. There's our header. And so I do represent the DuPage Birding Club. And I'm happy to be speaking today to the DuPage Organic Garden Club. Obviously, you guys are really on the ball. And some of the things that I'll talk about a little bit tonight, you've probably heard these things before. So that's great. And thanks to the Carroll Stream Library for hosting this. So our main topic tonight is going to be attracting hummingbirds to our yards. And sadly for me, we only have one species of hummingbird that generally shows up here in Illinois, and it's the ruby-throated hummingbird. And I love hummingbirds. There's really a lot of them out there. It's my favorite bird family. It's the second largest family in the world, only exceeded by the tyrant flycatchers. That family has, I think, over 425 species, and hummingbirds are about 350. And some of the things that I want to talk about tonight, I've got a little list here. We will talk about our attraction to hummingbirds and our appreciation of hummingbirds, and we'll see that hummingbirds have been in our lives for a very, very long time. I do want to give you a brief perspective on the world of hummingbirds, because we do have a very thin slice of the hummingbird world that's represented here in Illinois. And we will talk about the Midwestern hummingbirds that we can see. We'll talk about how to attract them to our yards. We'll talk about the food sources that they like, some of their favorite plant species, and we'll learn how to mix our own hummingbird nectar. One of the things that's very important is cleaning our hummingbird feeders. And if we're going to feed, that's probably the most important thing in the whole list here. And then we'll talk about hummingbird mortality. And then we'll also talk a little bit about courtship and nesting of ruby-throated hummingbirds. You can see that this talk already has an international flair to it. We have a sapphire spangled emerald. That's a hummingbird that we wouldn't see around here. But when I was putting this together for a different talk, somebody sent me this picture and wanted to get an ID on it. It's actually a species that we would see down in Argentina around Buenos Aires. So it's a female sitting on a nest. But so there you go. We're gonna see some hummingbirds in this program tonight that you might not see in your backyards. But it's good to know that they're out there. So as far as our appreciation for hummingbirds, you can see that we've been thinking about hummingbirds for a very, very long time. Some of these go way back in time. Here's a very crude carving in stone, and archaeologists have determined that this represents a hummingbird. And this one clearly represents a hummingbird. This is an example of the Nazca lines in Peru. And this is actually a very, very large drawing out in the desert. And the only way to really appreciate them is through flying over them. So this is an aerial view, but it's a very, very large representation of a hummingbird. This one is actually a petroglyph, and it comes from New Mexico. And when I first put this program together, I found this image. I was looking for some cultural representations of hummingbirds, and I came across this one, and I included it. And then about 3 years ago, I was actually in New Mexico on on a vacation, and we visited Petroglyphs National Monument, which is just outside of Albuquerque. And I found this very pictograph, and so, or petroglyph. And so this image that you're seeing here is actually one I took now. I replaced the one that I originally had in here, and it's a pretty cool image. If you look at this really fine pottery here, you can see that there's hummingbirds are represented down here in the artwork. This is actually a drumhead of Inuit and from up in Alaska, and those are hummingbirds. And then this, usually when I do this in person, I say that, you know, you should look to the person to the left of you and check their shoulder and see if this is where the tattoo came from. But this is actually a crimson topaz, is the hummingbird species that they're representing there. So all through, you know, hundreds of years, thousands of years, you know, we've been trying to replicate the beauty and the majesty of hummingbirds in many different ways. And so, you know, we certainly are well attuned to the family. And as far as having an appreciation for them, you can tell by the names that we give these birds that we do hold them in high regard. And these are just some examples from some of my travels. Most of these are my photos, but you can see we give them names that you know, represent, you know, the majesty of them and the colors of them. We have so many hummingbird species that have the word star in them here. There's a variety of wood stars. There are also hill stars. And so it just goes on and on. Some of them are emeralds, some of them are sapphires, some of them are topaz, some of them are rubies. So, I mean, there's just a variety of things. They're crowned, or they're empresses. Coquettes are some of my favorites. They're these little cute, tiny hummingbirds. But so we can go on and on about, you know, the various names that we give them. But obviously, you know, there's a lot of variety, and they're spectacular in their colors. Surprisingly, they only have a couple of colors. So this is something I don't normally talk about in this talk. I usually reserve this for my world hummingbird talk, but I've opened up the can of worms here. So when you see all these colors on a hummingbird, they are actually, there's only a couple of colors that show up on hummingbirds, true colors, and those are black and rufous and white, I guess. And so rufous is kind of a rusty color. Everything else that you see on hummingbirds is actually represented by smoke and mirrors. And it has to do with the way that all of the feathers are created, and all the little tiny barbules that are within those feathers, and how those individual barbules are filled with tiny little gas chambers, and how they refract the light is what gives these hummingbirds all the different colors that you see. So if you saw this hummingbird in low light or in the dark, you would see absolutely no color. You wouldn't see any blue. You wouldn't see any green at all. And that is the case for all of these hummingbirds and all the colors that are on them. So it'll explain why sometimes when we see ruby-throated hummingbirds, we don't see a ruby throat. So here's that world perspective that I promised you. And there are over 350 species of hummingbirds in the world. And the center of the hummingbird universe happens to be right here, where the equator crosses with the spine of the Andes. And that occurs in Ecuador. And Ecuador is a very small country. It's only about the size of Colorado, yet it has 163, roughly, species of hummingbirds in a country the size of the state of Colorado. And you can see as you move away from that center of their universe, as you move further and further south, or you move further and further north, the numbers of hummingbirds in each country is decreasing. Even Colombia and Peru, which are right next to Ecuador, they're 5 times the size of Ecuador, but you can already see that the numbers are starting to go down. Colombia has about 135 species. Peru, which is actually the birdiest country in the world, has only 127 hummingbird species. Altogether, as far as number of species in this country, there are over 1,800 species there. So South America is the birdiest continent in the world. Peru is the birdiest country in the world with over 1,800 species. In all of North America, anything that's north of the Rio Grande, so this large landmass here, we have about 750 species of birds that regularly occur. So in this huge landmass, we're talking about 750 species. And in Peru, we're talking about 1,800. So it's quite remarkable. But back to hummingbirds. So this is the center of our universe, and you can see that the numbers start to dwindle down. And Argentina and Chile are both very elongated countries. So, you know, Chile has 11 and Argentina has 24. But by the time you get all the way down here to the southern tip of South America in Tierra del Fuego, we're down to just one species. And the same thing is going on as we work our way up through Middle America and North America. And we get up here to Alaska and we're down to just one species. So here in the continental US, we have about 16 species. And of those 16, some of them make it up into Canada, about 5 of them. And of those, only 1 makes it up here. So you can see that the numbers dramatically decrease as we move northward. And of course, here in the eastern half of the United States, there's only 1 regularly occurring species, and that's the ruby-throated hummingbird. So if I'm going to find hummingbirds to look at, I need to go and travel quite a bit, obviously, to South America and Central America. I've seen about 210 species of hummingbirds now. So here are some examples, just to give you some feel for the diversity. Since we only do have that one species that we see in our backyards, I do want to give you some feel for just, the diversity of these birds. So this is a giant hummingbird. This is the biggest hummingbird that we have. And I'm sure all of you are gardeners and looking out in your backyards all the time. And I'm sure you're familiar with European starlings. Those are those black birds that kind of waddle through your grass looking for grubs because you didn't put any grubicide down. 3 cheers for that. And so your yard is full of grubs and it's going to attract those European starlings. Well, this hummingbird is as large as those starlings. So it's about 8.5 inches long. That's a huge hummingbird. And then at the other end of the extreme is the bee hummingbird, which is only found in Cuba. And I haven't seen this one yet. But if you look at your hand for a second, zero in on your pinky and look from the tip of your pinky and go down 2 joints. And that's the size of a bee hummingbird. It's a very, very tiny bird, smallest bird in the world, actually. And then we have some that have very ornate, odd-looking bills. And a lot of these are specialists that will pollinate only certain plants, usually in the Heliconia family. And there's a group of hummingbirds called hermits, and they split off from our typical hummingbirds about 40 million years ago. And all of them tend to have these, elaborate curved bills. And then we have bills to the extreme as well. Here's a sword-billed hummingbird picture. There's a lot of background noise in here, but that's what I had as a background when I was shooting. And you can see where my cursor is. The tip of the bill is out here, all the way back to here. So that bill is about as long as the entire body of this bird. So it's quite remarkable. And there is a lot of, fantastic plumages going on these birds. This is my next target bird. I'm hoping to see this bird in northern Peru in 2022. And Jesse Fagan, who took this photograph, he's actually going to be my guide on that trip. So hopefully we'll get that bird in 2022. But just an incredible looking bird with these long spatulate tail feathers here. Just remarkable. This is a long-tailed sylph. This is something that you can see easily in Ecuador and up into Colombia, probably down into Peru to some extent as well, and has a very long glowing tail. Wire-crested thorntail. Some of them have very elaborate crowns, and so this one does have a very wire-type crest coming up. Here's another example of a coquette. I love these coquettes, and they always have very interesting plumage. So great crests, and then they'll also get all sorts of very fancy feathers coming off of the throat area here as well. So again, quite a bit of diversity in these birds. But here's ours. Here's our ruby-throated hummingbird. And you can see that it does have a very, very large range. If we look at our range map here, you can see that certainly we're right in the center of their breeding range, and they do extend to somewhat out here into Western Canada. But for the most part, they're confined to the eastern half of the United States. And when they migrate out, most of them are taking a land route, and they're going down into Mexico, circumventing the crossing of the Gulf of Mexico. But some of them do actually make that crossing, that they're capable of doing that, even though it's about 600 miles across. They are capable of that kind of a flight. And then some of them do some island hopping. Some don't even leave the continent. We will have some overwintering ruby-throated hummingbirds in the southern part of Florida as well. But you can see they don't make it down into South America at all. They go as far as Panama, and that's as far south as I've ever seen one. I have had them in Panama. But to show you what the various plumages look like, this is what we expect the male to look like, and it does have that nice ruby throat. And then this is a immature male here, and you can see some little speckling in the throat. And those are those feathers starting to come in. And so we know that that's a young male. And then if the throat is completely clean is in this individual here, then we know we have a female. So you might see hummingbirds that look a little different at your feeder, but they're all really that one species for the most part, most likely. Here's a map that I captured a while back, and you can get a current version of this map by going to this website here, hummingbirds.net /map.html. And so if you go to that website, you'll actually find a more current version of this map. And what this map is generated every year. So we have people all across the continent that are busily hanging out their feeders right now, and they're watching to see when the hummingbirds are coming through. And when they do see their first hummingbird, ruby-throated hummingbird for the year, they'll actually log that. And so what we're seeing is the result of all those people logging in. And if you watch the numbers, you can kind of follow their progress up north, as they go. You can see in 2010, that's when all of this data is from, they hit the Chicagoland area around the 4th of April. So we're right on the doorstep of when these birds can be arriving. And those are first arrivals. So it's not like you're going to see hummingbirds all over the place. These are the real hardcore go-getters that are leading the charge to come up here and grab the best territories. So they're kind of on the leading edge. So even though they do show up on the 4th of April here in 2010, the bulk of the birds probably were, probably coming in the next couple of weeks beyond that. So an interesting thing, the progress of their migration is actually correlated with another species, the yellow-bellied sapsucker. And for those of you that have watched the Beverly Hillbillies and other sitcoms, you've heard that name before, but it is a species that actually exists. And it does exactly what its name says. It sucks sap. So in order to get that sap, they'll drill little holes in the trees. And if you've ever encountered a tree, and it's usually softwoods like pines or some of your popples, if you encounter a tree that has a row of nice rectangular holes in the bark, that's typically done by a yellow-bellied sapsucker. And so they're creating those sap wells so they can come back and that's their food source. Well, hummingbirds will take advantage of that sap well as well for two reasons. Insects will be drawn to those sap wells, and so they might go there and actually pick out the insects. And they'll also drink that sap that's coming from those wells. So as the sapsuckers are progressing north, hummingbirds are going to progress at the same time roughly, and they're probably not going to exceed the lateral or latitudinal movement of the sapsuckers. They're going to not go very far beyond them, if at all. Because think about it right now, here we are at the beginning of April, and how many flowers do you have blooming right now? So the sources for food for hummingbirds at this point would be that sap and insects. So it's kind of an interesting story that those two birds are correlated that way. Things have changed a little bit. It used to be a foregone conclusion that if you looked out your window and you saw a hummingbird, it was going to be a ruby-throated hummingbird. But things in the hummingbird world are changing now. And so we do have another species. It's the rufous hummingbird. And this is that one lone species that makes it up into Alaska. And this is what their typical breeding range looks like, is this area right here. And then they do migrate through the western states, and they end up coming down here into Mexico. So that's what's supposed to happen. But over the last, I don't know how many years, let's say it's 20 years or more, surprisingly, some rufous hummingbirds started showing up in this part of the United States. We're starting to get them in the Southeast, and we have them recorded in Florida and Georgia and Alabama and Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, North Carolina. That whole area is getting rufous hummingbirds now. And some of these birds are surviving. They know that because of bird banding programs where birds have been banded here in the Southeast, and they've returned the following year and been captured again, but they already have a band on them, and they read those numbers off and they find out that it's a bird that was actually banded in the Southeast previously. So we know that the birds are actually making this migration route here to a new part of the continent, and they're surviving in doing it. So they're probably most likely, for the most part, they're actually heading back up here. But on that route, it's not just a straight beeline like that. And so they're kind of, curving out through this area here, and they're coming through Illinois. So we're starting to get records of rufous hummingbirds in Illinois. And I keep trying to attract one to my yard, but I have been unsuccessful so far. So here's a similar map that shows, it doesn't quite show in detail what we were seeing on the map for the ruby-throated hummingbird migration, but still all these little markers here are showing you at certain points in time, where the birds were located. So they are starting out down here. These triangles actually represent winter records. So these are where birds were wintering. And as I was saying, you can see that, we have records in Alabama, in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. There's even in Tennessee, there's a winter record, and certainly in Florida. So what I find amazing about this is that these birds are not all going back to their traditional breeding grounds anymore. We are actually getting records here in Maine. So we actually have a couple of records of rufous hummingbirds in the springtime showing up in Maine. So I think it's just a matter of time. If these birds are successful and they come down here in winter and go back up here to breed, if they continue to do that, we're going to end up with a population of rufous hummingbirds now breeding east of the Mississippi. And so I think over time, not in our lifetime probably, but we could end up with rufous hummingbirds actually breeding here in Illinois. So I think that's quite remarkable. So as much as I've searched and kept my eyes peeled for rufous hummingbirds, I finally did get to see one here in Illinois, and that was in Lisle this past December. And so this was a female, and she was just very late in migration, obviously, if it was December 1st, so that's very late. And we'll talk about that and when you should be taking your hummingbird feeders in. Obviously, you don't want to take them in too early because it ends up being a lifeline for a bird like this that for whatever reason is migrating very late. So she took advantage of this, this host. We had a family in Lisle that was actually, they had their feeders out and they recognized the fact that all of a sudden they were getting a hummingbird coming in December, and they kept that feeder out for a couple of weeks as long as the hummingbird was there. And they religiously, they would actually take the feeder in every night so the nectar wouldn't freeze. And then they would put it out before daylight in the morning. And eventually they got tired of that, and they found that there are actually heated hummingbird feeders, something I was not aware of. But they had a hummingbird coming to their yard for about 2 weeks in December. And so what I've come to realize is that I don't have the right habitat in my yard to attract rufous hummingbirds. I don't have any inflatable lawn decorations, and I don't have little signs all over the place. Here's where the feeder actually is there's a little red dot just above my cursor here. And so that's actually the feeder. And they did have a bunch of other feeders here, but you can see that, this is not great. That wouldn't, in my mind, this is not great hummingbird habitat, but this is where the bird settled in. So maybe it was attracted by this red here, and then from there it found the feeder. I don't know, but obviously I'm not landscaping my backyard well enough to get rufous hummingbirds. I'm going to get an inflatable Thanksgiving turkey or something for next year. So let's talk a little bit about actually attracting hummingbirds to our yards. And for some of us, it could be simply just getting that hummingbird feeder out. For those of us that are lucky, that's all it takes. You hang out a feeder and hummingbirds will quickly find it. And the reason for that is because they're very curious, and you can think of a hummingbird because of its high metabolism and its small size. You can think about this bird as being, a couple hours away from starvation all day long. So they're constantly searching for new food sources. They're very, very curious because of that, and they're very aggressive because of that. So they want to protect their food sources. So they will find you most likely. And the best time to get them to become acquainted with your yard is in that spring migration or the fall migration. If you're successful in getting them then, it's just a matter of time before you'll actually have them during the breeding season as well. And so if that isn't working for you, then you might want to try adding some plants. And certainly there is a lot of horticultural plants to choose from. In this case here, I'm showing some red salvia. Red seems to be very popular, but I'll show you some examples that will indicate that red is not anywhere near as important as you might think. But certainly it does draw them in, but they'll feed on any color flower. But there's lots of options. There's lots of things you can put in your yard. And this is just one example, the red salvia. So adding plantings that will provide nectar throughout the breeding season would be a great way to get them into your yards. And then a third thing that we quite often utilize to get birds into our yards would be a bird bath. But I seldom see hummingbirds. I've never actually seen a hummingbird in my bird bath. You can see this one actually has a little misting device attached to it. So there is misting going on, and hummingbirds do seem to like that. When I've been out watering plants in my yard, if I have the nozzle set so that it's a light mist that's coming out of the nozzle head, quite often I'll have hummingbirds fly right up into that mist, and they kind of dance around in the mist, and then they'll go and perch somewhere and preen for a while, and they'll come right back to the water source out of my hose, and they'll get into the mist once again. I've only seen them, hummingbirds, actually take a full-blown bath in the wild one time, and that was down in Belize, and we had a hummingbird. It was called a purple-crowned fairy, and it was flying over a small puddle, and it kind of looked like it was inspecting the puddle to make sure there was no danger in the area, and then all of a sudden it just took a complete plunge down into the water, completely immersed itself, came bursting out, shook off the water, landed and perched, and preened itself for a while, and then it continued to do that, dive bombing right into the water several times. Up here, the closest thing I've ever seen is after you have a rainstorm, or after doing some watering on large broadleaf plants, you might have some water droplets that will collect, and the hummingbirds will actually land on that leaf, and they'll actually roll their bodies into those little water bubbles, and they'll actually bathe that way as well. So I don't think the water is crucial. I think it's mostly getting that feeder out and getting some plants in place, and we'll talk more about plants. Let's talk for a second about hummingbird diet. And of course, we know that they'll go after nectar and flowers. And so this is a typical representation here. We have a columbine, and we kind of always associate that plant with hummingbirds. And you can see they're acting as good pollinators. You can actually see that some of the pollen is showing up here on the side of the head of this hummingbird here. They actually capture insects too, and they do that in a couple of ways. They will fly catch, which means that they'll actually fly out from a perch and they'll capture flying insects and then consume them that way. And this representation here, this is actually a hummingbird going to a spider's web, and it's plucking insects out of the spider web and stealing them from the spider. So that's another way that they can get some protein. And they'll utilize that spider web in other applications as well, but it turns out it's a very dangerous gamble for them to get anywhere near a spider's web. They can end to their demise. And then here's an example of sap wells that were drilled out by a sapsucker, and you can see they are in a row, and lots of times you'll see nice neat rows like that, and they're usually rectangular as far as the carving that is taking place. And here we have a hummingbird visiting that. And again, they're not only coming in to suck the sap, just like the sapsuckers, but they're also going after any insects that could be trapped in that sap as well. So during certain times of their the breeding cycle, it's very important for them to go and find a higher protein diet, such as those insects. So when they're trying to raise those young and they're trying to get them to grow as fast as possible, they're going to want to have a lot of protein in their diet. And then when they're also molting their feathers out, that's another occasion where they would want to have a lot of protein. So I mentioned that hummingbirds are always looking for that next meal, and they can be very aggressive and they can be very curious. So here I was this is in Ecuador, and we were on the east slope of the Andes. We were at about 4,500 feet in elevation, and we were staying at a place called Wild Sumaco Lodge. And it was on this post here, there was a large bank of hummingbird feeders. They were all starting to run out of their nectar. Earlier in this episode, friends of ours had come out, and one of them was carrying this red book. And so I noticed that the birds were attracted to the red book. So I asked if I could borrow it. And I just laid it in my lap. And within seconds, I had hummingbirds landing on my knee. So I thought that was pretty cool. But I thought, well, what if I put my fingers around the corners to form a perch? And sure enough, it kind of blends in here because of this railing, which is dark. But there's actually a hummingbird sitting on my finger right here. And so he was just poking down into this little dark area, just like it was a port on a hummingbird feeder, and kept looking and looking to see if there was, a food source down there. Obviously there wasn't. But you can see this guy here in the background in a yellow rain slick, and he's actually taking down the feeders as they were emptying out. They're being sucked dry by the hummingbirds. And he's in the process of cleaning them and refilling them over here. Well, as the numbers of feeders was starting to dwindle, the hummingbirds were getting more agitated. And this is a golden-tailed sapphire here, quite a beautiful hummingbird. And I ended up having one of these flying right next to the side of my head. I could feel him hovering there. I could actually feel his feathers touching my cheeks. And the next thing I knew was I felt his bill go into my ear, and I felt his little tongue zip out one time and back, and then he left. So that was quite remarkable. I've never ever had anything like that happen to me before. I've been down to Central and South America about 25 times now, and that was a first for me. Well, then, this is a brown violet ear here, and there were quite a few brown violet ears around, and all of a sudden I had a flurry of them all around this book. And one of them came up and he was right in my face, and I kept thinking, don't poke me in the eye. And he didn't. Instead, he dropped down a little bit and he got me in the nose. And these are all true stories. I have no pictures to prove that because the person sitting next to me was laughing too much. So, but it's all true. It's all kind of a wild thing. I've never ever had anything like that happen before. But they weren't crazy about earwax, and they weren't crazy about anything in my nose either. They only came into that one time. So about 3 years later, that original episode happened in 2015. So I went back and I was at the same lodge in 2018. And this time I came prepared. I thought if these birds were willing to attack me to get a meal, I should be able to go, with a handheld little jar and get them to land on my finger. So here I had this little jar, and I painted the rim red, the same color red as the hummingbird feeders. And I drew a little line here because I pre-tested things at home, and I figured out how much water I needed to mix with 3 sugar packets. And so I kind of just had to fill up to that level and then stir it all up. And here I am approaching these hummingbirds to give them this free meal. They should be so happy. And you can tell by the posture of these birds, they do not want to have anything to do with me at all. So I don't know what the magic was of that one particular day. Again, I've never had that happen before, but for some reason, they were all over me that day. And here they just, shunned me completely. But then in Jamaica, just 2 Decembers ago, we were visiting a bird sanctuary right outside of Montego Bay. And there they have the hummingbirds habituated to actually come to drink nectar out of little whiskey bottles you get on the airplane. Obviously, they don't have whiskey in them anymore, but they do fill that up with sugar water. And the hummingbirds will come and land on you. So this is a red-billed streamer tail. I don't know if you can see the tail, but the tail's going down all the way down to here. So it's a really cool-looking hummingbird, and it does have a very red bill. But I had several of those landing on my finger. I also had Jamaican mangoes landing on my finger. So we made up again, and we were once again friends. So it was great to have hummingbirds visiting me again. So back to our backyards and talking some more about, what are some of the food sources that we can provide in our own backyards. I have a variety of plants. I'm in the process of converting my whole yard over to native plants. And little by little, I'm making progress on that. But we do have a lot of native plants already in the yard. This is actually yellow honeysuckle, which is a native honeysuckle. And it grows in a vine form. And it has not what I would call an elaborate looking or attractive flower. You can see obviously there's no red in it. Well, the hummingbirds go nuts over this flower. They just love this one. So I'm trying to expand my population of that plant in the yard. I have some remnant rhododendrons in the yard, and they will utilize that as well. So even though they're not native to our area, hummingbirds do like that. Here's that columbine we all know about. But here's Solomon seal. And this is a plant that you wouldn't suspect would attract hummingbirds. The flowers themselves are very nondescript, and they're not very large, but hummingbirds love this plant. This is another native shrub. This is dwarf honeysuckle, and you can see it has very, very tiny yellow flowers. But I've had hummingbirds even feeding off of these tiny, tiny tubular flowers on this plant. And spiderwort is a prairie plant. So a variety of habitats represented here, from sunny areas to shady areas. But all of them have plants that will provide some kind of nectar source for our hummingbirds. And I got this video from a friend of mine, Mark Donnelly is his name. We're going to show you this. And this is a hummingbird coming to feed on the Solomon seal, surprisingly. They'll hit just about every one of those little bells, and they seem to know exactly where to go. I was just reading about a study that was done. I'll show you to you one more time while I'm talking. The hummingbirds are actually smart enough to know what kind of output they can get of nectar, from various flower species, and they also know how long it takes for the the flowers to regenerate their supply of nectar. So their visits are actually timed out so that they don't waste their time going to flowers that aren't going to have nectar. So that's quite remarkable. When we think about how small these birds are and how small their brain is probably about the size of a grain of rice, but they're able to retain that kind of information, that kind of knowledge, so that they're efficient in their foraging for nectar. So here's some more open type habitat species. Butterfly weed is great for them. Even things like blazing star, New Jersey tea. Here's some wild petunia, hoary vervain, foxglove beard tongue. These are all natives, and they're all kind of prairie type plants for the most part. Some can put up with a little more shade than others, but they're all things that you can easily grow in your yard, and hummingbirds do love all of those. Here's some more examples, even things like purple coneflower, things like palm sedge, which is Carex muskingamensis. It's it doesn't have a showy flower at all, but hummingbirds will actually utilize that. Here's wild bergamot, got cardinal flower, which you would expect. It's so bright red. That's what we anticipate, hummingbirds will like. But, look at all these other flowers. Here in the same genus, we've got the great blue lobelia. So not red at all, but, it's loved by the hummingbirds just as much as the cardinal flower. And even things like smooth blue aster. So what's great about this is, these are all great for hummingbirds, but they're also great for all of our pollinators. So, we can be solving a lot of our problems, by creating these little islands of sanctuary for our birds as they're migrating or breeding, or all the insects as well. Just the 98% that we like, not those other 2%. So out of the things that I've just shown you, and that's a small sampling, but here's that list, and I've given you both the common name and I've given you the scientific name for all of these things. If you want to retain this, you can actually hit print screen on your laptop right now, and then you can just save that off to a Word document and print it later. So if you do go to one of your local nurseries, you can make sure you're getting the right plants by making sure that the scientific names are matching up. Because there's, common names are less reliable in that regard. So at any rate, that's available to you. And you're not going to find the plants that you're looking for. You're not likely to find them in your box stores. You are going to have to go to some of those local garden centers, or there's opportunities to get a lot of these plants through a lot of native plant sales that'll be going on this spring. The DuPage Forest Preserve District has one that is this year. Unfortunately, it's all online ordering, pre-ordering, so you can't go in and just shop around. But they have a lot of these native plants available to you, and so you can buy them in pint size, sometimes larger, and you can start stocking your yard with some of the natives that you could would be beneficial for our hummingbirds or for some of our other pollinators. The Conservation Foundation also has a plant sale that's coming up. I don't think theirs is open yet, but I think it's the end of April is when you can start ordering. So you could go and check that out, go to their website. Wheaton has a very good native plant sale that I've never actually attended, and that one is going to be in person this year. So you can actually go there and pick out plants that you want. So there's lots of sources to get these native species. Your club being into organic gardening, you probably are well aware of a lot of these things, but I thought it was worth noting anyway. And you probably know more than I do about some of these opportunities. So let's talk a little bit about bird feeders or hummingbird feeders. And you can see there's a variety of different feeders. Here's one that's actually stuck to the window, so you're bringing the birds up close. Whether that's an issue with the windows or not, I'm not sure. The theory behind that is if you're bringing them that close, they can't really create any speed in order to hurt themselves when they do bounce off of the glass. That's what I've heard people rationalize for something hung right on the window like that. Quite often they end up being a satellite type dish like this. Down in the tropics, I see some that aren't even enclosed. They're just totally open. It looks like just like a big soup bowl full of nectar. And I've seen, situations where they have, it's much larger than this. And you can have 30 or so hummingbirds all just encircling this thing. It's quite incredible. And we see this type of hummingbird feeder quite often. It does have little perches. It does have little bee guards. And the reservoir that goes and feeds into this portion of the feeding portion of the feeder actually has a small opening. So we'll talk a little bit about that and what some of the pros and cons are. But this is one that you quite often see in advertising and in people's yards. But they can take any shape and form. In this one here, you have just a regular bottle, and it does have this little eyedropper kind of thing, little port here at the end, and the hummingbird obviously is coming to that. So if there's a food source, they'll find it. They found my nose and my ears, so they should be able to find just about any kind of feeder you have in your yard. And we can mix our own sugar water to supply them. And the ratio for that is 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. And you can mix that any way you want in terms of volume. What I tend to do is I mix maybe 2 tablespoons of water to 8 tablespoons. 2 tablespoons of sugar to 8 tablespoons of water. So I just tone it down because that's all the volume I need before I'm going to have to change the nectar or the sugar water in the feeder, which we want to do on a regular basis. So you can mix in larger volumes and then store it in your refrigerator. But even doing that, it's only going to last for a couple of weeks. So I tend to just mix it as I need it. But you can go either way on that. And you want to use cane sugar. I've read that beet sugar works as well, but you don't want to get into any of these artificial sweeteners or honey or anything like that. So stay away from that. Stick with good old-fashioned cane sugar. Tap water is fine, and you do not have to boil the water in order to make your mixture. It will dissolve in just plain water. If you do mix it in boiling water, then you're going to want to make sure you cool it down before you actually take it out in the yard. And there's absolutely no reason whatsoever to add food coloring. You can see that this is obviously clear here. And if you do want to have red as part of your attraction to your hummingbird feeder, obviously there's opportunities to have red. Even this one here has a little red tip on it. But the sugar water itself does not need to be colored at all. So the key thing is to be replacing your sugar water quite regularly, especially in the summertime when it gets hot out. Normally you want to change it at least once a week. And when it's really hot out, you're going to want to do it even more frequently than that. And that's because bacteria will build up. And that can be very detrimental to the hummingbirds. That bacteria can kill them. So you want to have hummingbird feeders that you can get at and clean well, and that and just you have to decide that you're going to feed them or clean them regularly. Otherwise, you probably shouldn't be doing this. So as I mentioned, you can mix an ample supply, keep that in your refrigerator for a couple of weeks. So here I am going through the process of cleaning my hummingbird feeder. And because it takes a while to do all this, you probably want to have multiple feeders. So you don't want them out, wondering what happened to their feeder. You can, swap them out. And that's what I typically do. I'll bring one in to clean, and I have others that I can put in their place. So here's the feeder. This is a style that I really like a lot. I've kind of have come to make this my favorite feeder. And the reason for that is you can see that where it ties into the saucer part, this reservoir has a very wide opening. It's a big mouth here. And so that means it's very easy to get into this reservoir and clean it very thoroughly. And then this satellite portion here, or saucer part, you can see that breaks open with a quick snap. That opens up. And you can see there's lots of places for bacteria to build up. So we do want to open it up, and we do want to scrub that up really well. What you'll see developing if you do leave it out too long is along some of these little edges and whatnot, you'll start seeing black building up. So that's a bad sign. So you want to make sure you scrub all of that out very thoroughly. And in cleaning it, you have a couple of different ways you can go. Some people use bleach. In that case, you'd put 1 part bleach to 10 parts of water. I think vinegar would probably work the same way. And again, you'd probably want to keep that same ratio. I just end up using soapy water, and that works out fine. So I have a scrubby brush that I use along with that soapy water, and I just make sure I get every little nook and cranny in there. And then in any case, no matter what you're using as your cleaner, then you want to rinse all the suds off. And then I typically go through and triple rinse everything. So after all the suds are off, I rinse everything again 3 times, and that should get any residue off that might hurt the hummingbirds as well. And then you just let it air dry, and now you're back in business, and you can put it all back together and use that. And so it may seem like a lot of work, but if that does seem like a lot of work to you, then maybe you shouldn't be feeding hummingbirds because it's very important. We don't want to kill the hummingbirds that we're trying to attract. So, and one of the easiest ways for them to die is to become ill from that bacteria buildup. So, which leads me to hummingbird mortality. There's lots of ways for hummingbirds to meet their demise. I mentioned that hummingbirds are using spider webs quite often. Well, as they visit those spider webs, they can actually get tangled up in them. And here's an example. You can see that this hummingbird has gotten all twisted up in there. And once they're in there, it's impossible for them to get themselves out. So not only hummingbirds can have this issue. I've actually seen warblers, small itty bitty other birds that have visited spider webs in order to plunder some of the insects that are trapped in there. And I've seen them get hung up as well. Another thing, surprisingly, that can get hummingbirds into trouble is if you leave your porch door open or garage door, and they'll see something red in there, and they go zipping in to check it out as a food source, and they get confused and they can't find their way back out. Especially when there's big windows like this, they're attracted to that as an exit way, and they get hung up on that and mesmerized by that, and they just don't see the way that they came in. They're just stuck now in there, and it's just as I mentioned, because of their high metabolism. They're so close to starvation all day long. So they don't have to be in there very long and they can die. So I've had more than one person bring me a hummingbird that's dead because it got trapped in their garage. So that's something to keep in mind, to keep those doors closed. If you do end up with a situation where a hummingbird is trapped in your garage or something, don't try to capture it. You're more likely to injure it than anything else. What I would do is I would set up a hummingbird feeder that they can come to. That'll be an opportunity for them to refresh themselves. And not only that, but now they're going to be relying on that hummingbird feeder, and you can slowly inch it towards the exit. And as they continue to visit it, they'll be getting closer and closer, and pretty soon they'll figure out their way out. Another thing that can be an issue for them is to get hung up in something like burdock. And those of you in the plant community that know about these plants, there's on these little spikes that are coming out, there's actually a little hook on the end of each one of them, and so those can actually trap the hummingbird by attaching to their feathers. And I've seen that. I've rescued a Tennessee warbler one time that was hung up that way. I've seen a dead ruby-crowned kinglet that way. I've yet to actually see a hummingbird, but obviously this picture tells the story. And I actually did find a bat one time that was hung up in burdock and died. So it's a plant that can cause a major issue for hummingbirds. And here's some other ways that they can run into trouble. Hummingbirds in visiting their feeders. Well, praying mantises can figure that out. And so they'll actually try to ambush hummingbirds at the feeders. And this is, this shows got our ambusher right here, the praying mantis, and he's not successful yet. But if you go on the internet, you'll find lots of pictures, many pictures of praying mantises hanging onto hummingbirds that are just dangling. So they are successful in that effort. And snakes will do the same thing, although I don't have any pictures that represent that. In the tropics, I've seen situations where snakes are trying to ambush hummingbirds at flowers, and I've not seen it at feeders, but I have seen them at flowers, like large bromeliads and things like that. So window strikes are a big issue, and then pesticides. And pesticides are harmful in two ways. If it doesn't directly get the hummingbird itself, it can get all of its food source. And again, that protein during certain parts of the breeding cycle are so important. It's that protein source. So they will feed on those insects. It'll kill their young potentially because of the poison. And eventually, working its way up the food chain, it can kill the adult birds as well. So on a happier note, let's talk a little bit about ruby-throated hummingbird courtship. And the way this game works, those male hummingbirds are the ones that are driving, hard to get up here. That's why they're up here on April 4th in 2010. I mean, they're coming up here to get the best territories. And what makes a good territory is all those food sources. So if your yard is full of, lots of flowers that can be utilized by hummingbirds, chances are some male is going to establish a territory in your neighborhood. And a territory is maybe 4 or 5 backyards or something like that. Maybe it extends a little further. I don't have any hard numbers on that, but that male is obviously the territory. If he's going to protect the territory, it has to be small enough that he can keep an eye on all of it. And so I can't imagine it being a whole lot larger than maybe 5 backyards or so. So its goal is to establish that territory, protect that territory, because that territory represents, a value. And so when females come up, they're going to look at that territory. They're going to look at that male, and they can tell that, he's a strong male because he can hang on to that territory. Also, some of his, plumage features and whatnot also represent the fact that he's a very healthy individual. So the female is making her choice, and she decides that, yes, she's going to mate with that male. So they will mate. Chances are she will utilize a portion of that territory, and she'll actually make her nest on that territory somewhere. But once the heavy lifting of the mating and protection of that territory is all done, it's all up to the female from that point forward. So she's going to make that nest, she's going to lay those eggs, and she's going to raise those young all on her own. So while all that's going on, that male is waiting for the next female to come along that's attracted to his territory. And so you could have multiple females nesting within a territory, but just that one male. And in addition to all the hard work he's doing to protect that territory, he's also, if he has a female that he wants to mate with, they will do an aerial flight display. And that typically is a elliptical flight pattern, and she'll be perched somewhere nearby, and he just does this flight where he goes up into the air, comes flying back down, breakneck speeds, and then loops and goes back up again. They'll just keep doing that over and over again. I've witnessed that a couple of times. It is quite impressive to see. When that female is building that nest, it can take her about a week to do that, and she will they'll nest in amazing places. They can nest very low. They'll nest high in trees, usually on little thin branches. The nest is very small. If we look at this image here, this opening is only about the size of a quarter. And as far as those eggs, go back and look at your pinky again, and now look at the fingernail. And that's about the size, maybe a little smaller than that. That's the size of these eggs. So very, very small. And so she can fit in here, obviously, but then at some point in time, these little eggs are going to hatch, and we're going to have chicks in here. And so there's going to be an issue there with size. So in the construction of this nest, there's a lot of soft material that's being collected, and it's then camouflaged with lichens, and you can see that represented pretty well in this image. So you can see a lot going on here to disguise the outside of the nest. The inside will have really a lot of soft material in it. I've seen hummingbirds collecting things like the fluff from cattails, and they're utilizing that on the inside of the nest, and other plant material that would be very soft and fluffy like that also goes into it. So all of this is wrapped together with spider webbing. And so that once again, they're visiting that spider web, and they're utilizing the webbing now in their nesting material. And the advantage to that is that it's going to be held together by all of that spider webbing, but it's flexible. And so as these chicks start to grow, that nest can actually expand with them. So I think that's a pretty remarkable thing. So here again, from our good friend Mark Donnelly, we have a little video that we can show you. And so I'll give you a second to see if you can find the nest in this image. It's actually kind of hard to spot them usually. I've had very little luck finding hummingbird nests, at least here in North America. When I go to South America, it seems I have a lot better luck down there. But I'll show you a little video here now. She'll bring you right to the nest. And so she's obviously still working on the nest. She doesn't have any young in there or anything yet. You can see it does have all the little lichens attached to the outside of it. And so it's pretty well camouflaged. And again, that's very, very tiny. It's a very small nest. We'll look at that one more time. So there you go. So I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to view this video or this webinar. And hopefully we've given you some bird food for thought. And if you want to learn more about bird-related topics, for some of you that came in early, I was talking about the DuPage Birding Club, and we do have a YouTube education channel. And we now have probably 60 some releases on that education channel. And we do release something new the first and third Wednesday of every month. So it's constantly being updated. A lot of the things that were released in the last year are all timely topics. And so there's a lot of things that we released last spring that are valuable information for this spring. So if you want to learn more about hummingbirds or other birds, what's going on in DuPage County as far as birds, many, many different topics. And you can find all those by going to the DuPage Birding Club website, and there you'll find a link to the YouTube education channel. And from there, you can get all sorts of information. So I'm going to stop my share at this point, and hopefully some questions have come in, and I'll be happy to answer questions on hummingbirds or anything else bird related. So it's all fair game tonight. So ask away.
Great. Thanks, Dennis. That was fantastic. Let's look at what we've got. I thought there was one early on. Oh, someone had asked what
otherwise I'll have to make stuff up,
Usually what happens is there's a couple at the very beginning and then people start asking questions as we go along.
Okay.
But Cheryl had asked early on what was the thing in the bird bath, but then Kim and Tom answered water mister, and you had actually addressed it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Sue asked for the video, the first video that you showed, was that the non-native Solomon seal?
Oh, no, that was a native. That was a native.
Native, okay.
Yeah, because it actually had the little bells hanging from underneath. And it's something that I've collected. I was manager for natural areas for St. Charles Park District. So when we would do plant rescues in various situations, some of those things would be rescued to the far east campus in Naperville, Illinois, where my backyard is. So a couple things would end up there. And since from that, I've been able to propagate. I have converted most of my backyard, which is very shady, to all native woodland plants. So I have a large population of Solomon seal. I have the two popular false Solomon seals as well, both the feathery and the starry. So they're all represented out there.
Okay. Wendy shared from DuPage.wildones.org the native plant sales page and then the native plant nurseries. So check that out. Jeff said, we have problems with hornets and yellow jackets at feeders chasing away the hummingbirds.
Okay, and that is a common issue. We have a couple things that, everything likes to have that sugar water. So ants are a big issue. And likewise, we do get yellow jackets and things like that. So this past year, I didn't have a big problem with yellow jackets, so I didn't really work on that one too hard. The thing that I did find a solution for, and it's a pretty easy one, and that's when you're dealing with ants. And I will get back to the yellow jackets in just a second. But here's an ant moat. And so where you would normally hang your feeder, instead you hang via this hook on the top where my fingers are. You hang this up, and this little reservoir actually fills up with water. And then you have this ring on the bottom, and that's where you'll hang your feeder. So now let's say you have a shepherd's hook hanging, where you hang your feeder. You put this between the shepherd's hook and the feeder, and now that moat of water keeps the ants out. So that's one problem solved. The next problem that comes along is the fact that as much as chickadees seem to not come to my bird bath to drink water, when they see this little tiny cup, they just seem to love that. And so I always have chickadees emptying my water supply in here. So that becomes a problem. That's how you should get rid of your ants. There's a lot of home remedies like putting Vaseline on the shepherd's hook or something like that. And that's a dangerous game to play, because then the birds can come in contact with it, and having those oil-based products on their feathers is going to be a big issue. So we've solved one problem. We've solved the ant problem. So the next one is those yellow jackets. And the feeder that I use does have rather small ports to it, but even those small ports, they can still get in there. And on more than one occasion, I've brought yellow jackets in the house when I've brought this in to clean it. So that can be an issue. I don't like the bee guards. You can utilize those if you want, but I don't like them only because it's just more places for bacteria to grow. So I'd rather, as long as I don't have a situation where yellow jackets have gone crazy, the hummingbirds usually manage to get their meal, and they come back and they feed. So I put up with the yellow jackets to a certain extent. Again, I don't like the bee guards because of the bacteria issue. So another thing, I was doing some reading, and they say that as much as hummingbirds seem to like red, the yellow jackets and bees like yellow. And what color do they make those bee guards? They make them yellow. So if you keep yellow things away from your feeder, that may help. Another interesting thing that has come up is that you can actually make your own fake hornet nest. And you can take like a paper bag and you fill that up with newspaper or something like that, and just kind of make it look like this bulky thing, and you hang that up in a tree nearby. And I guess the yellow jackets and the hornets aren't the best of friends. And so just having that hanging that there can actually deter how many yellow jackets are coming to that area. And I've seen people not utilize it for the purpose of keeping it away, yellow jackets away from their feeders, but I've seen people who are having picnics trying this method, and I've seen it work with some success. So it might be worth trying that out. Another thing that I've seen people have said that placement of your feeder might be advantageous. If you put it more in the shade, you're less likely to get yellow jackets. In the sun, you're more likely to. I have not personally witnessed the difference between shade or sun. And as far as putting them there, either place, because that's a question that comes up too, where should I put my feeders? And I have feeders both in the shade and in the sun. And the only thing about the sun is when you get into the summertime and it's pretty hot out, you're going to be changing that sugar water more frequently, because the hotter it is, the more quickly it's going to go bad. And then people ask how high or how low you should put your feeders. I've seen hummingbird feeders hung inches off of the ground in South America anyway. And I had somebody on one of these talks that I did, and they said that they had a little balcony on their condo, and they were on the 4th floor. And so they had hummingbirds coming to their feeder on the 4th floor. So you can hang it that high as well. Okay, that was a long answer, but go ahead. Okay, next question.
This isn't a question. It was a Sue offered. We found that peppermint essential oil rubbed on the hummingbird feeder keeps bees away. The hummingbirds can't smell, but so it doesn't bother them.
I think I've seen examples where supposedly most birds have a poorly developed olfactory section in their brains, and that's been always what scientists have believed. But they're finding more and more cases where birds actually smell better than they think. And I certainly have had examples where I've convinced myself that hummingbirds found me or someone near me by smelling. One time I was camping in the Rockies in Colorado, and it was dark already. And my friend, he was going to brush his teeth, and the smell of the toothpaste brought out a hummingbird. And actually got in his face. So, and another time, my wife and I, we were hiking in, we were in Glacier National Park, and she had just applied some cherry Blistex, and which had a cherry smell to it, and hummingbird came right in at her. So to me, it wasn't an issue of red. She wasn't wearing any red or anything. So those are two examples where it certainly looked like hummingbirds were attracted to scent. And although most plants that are hummingbird specialists, and we do have that going on, there's this, they've evolved together. And so there's plants that they prefer, and they've moved away from insects as pollinators, and they prefer hummingbirds as pollinators. And so they don't waste their energy producing scent. It's more about the color, and it's more about the structure of the plant. And so they're not trying to attract insects anymore, so they don't bother with scent. So I don't know. I've got lots of good stories.
It's all good information. Someone was asking, when you're making your own sugar water for cane sugar, can it be raw?
Yeah.
Okay. Yusha says, thanks a lot for a great program. Teresa offers to Jan, congratulations, Jan, on your 50th anniversary. I remember the earlier club meetings and homes. So again, congratulations, Jan. Jeff offers for cleaning, you can use a Q-tip to clean the small places in feeder. And then that's that. Cheryl said, this was great, Dennis. Thank you. Nancy said, thank you. This is a wonderful presentation. Bill and Christine, we have goldfinches. Will their presence or other birds cause hummingbirds to avoid our yard?
Well, not at all. Not at all. The hummingbirds, again, they're just so aggressive. Once they find that food source, and they know who's after that same food source. So the goldfinch isn't very likely to be going after that nectar, so they're not really worried about him. They might worry about orioles, because orioles, when they're migrating through, they quite often like to make a stop at hummingbird feeders and sip the nectar. So that might be an issue for them. But for most birds, they might be startled by the flight or something if you're hanging your hummingbird feeder near where you have your other feeders or something. But for the most part, it's not an issue. They know who their competitors are.
Okay. Joyce, great and informative presentation. Thanks for sharing all your knowledge. Sue asks, is it too late to clean my birdhouses?
No, I haven't seen, in my yard, I haven't seen the chickadees going to town yet. Wrens are not back yet. House sparrows, we're not worried about making a home for them. So no, it's not too late to do that. But you should probably get on it. And bluebirds are starting to come back. If you're talking about bluebird houses, they're just starting to come back. So if you do it now, it'd still be in time.
Okay. Miriam says, I tend to get so many ants in the hummingbird feeder, but that may have been before you mentioned the cup to protect it.
I found that the moat made all the difference in the world. Because I was having quite an issue as well. But now you have to find a way to keep the chickadees out of your moat.
Sue Grudy, thank you for your presentation. Looking forward to welcoming these little jewels. Miriam, you just answered my question. Let's see. I have been advised to quit. This is from Susan. I've been advised to quit feeding other birds in May and through the summer and resume in the fall. Do you feel this way?
I don't think it's a huge issue. I don't know why you would stop. I'm not a huge feeder person anyway, so I don't always have feeders set up. This past year that kind of changed because I was trapped at home. But I see no reason to stop. The birds are only using your feeders, whether we're talking about the hummingbirds or we're talking about any bird species. They use that to kind of supplement their diet. They're still going to feed on their natural food sources, and they'll use those extensively. There's times when in the summer when the hummingbird feeders are hardly using my hummingbird feeders because they are raising young, and so they're now looking more for protein. And I've sat on my back patio and I watch, and instead of the hummingbirds going to my feeders, they're actually surveying the wall of my house or a wall of shrubs. And what they're doing is they're looking for insects. They're looking for spiders, which have a lot of protein. They're looking for flying insects, crawling insects, and so there's times when they won't use the feeder, but again, they will take advantage of natural food sources probably 75% of the time. So their visits to your feeding stations are not that great. So I would, if you like seeing the birds in your yard, keep feeding them, and I don't see the harm in that.
Okay. Jeff made an observation that he saw a male hummingbird attack another male at the feeder.
And so, an interloper coming into somebody else's territory. So most likely that's what was going on there. And I seldom, it's surprising. Obviously there's a male somewhere around my house. We've got all these females, so I'm a part of some territory, and I very seldom see a male at my feeder. So I don't know where he's feeding, or if he's just sneaking in when I'm not looking. But, typically, if I see any males, it's just one at my feeder. I don't have a gazillion hummingbirds. I could show you videos of what it's really like when you have a lot of hummingbirds, but I maybe have a half a dozen individuals that are utilizing my feeder in the summertime. It's probably not much more than that. It's hard to keep track and figure out how many exactly are coming to your feeder. But you can, if you really stare at them, you can tell markings that can reflect the fact that you're looking at one individual versus another. It might be a draw and you can't tell, but sometimes you can tell you're looking at an individual.
Okay. And then actually, I don't see any more questions. So if there's more questions, please put them into the chat. The last one is just thanks. It was very good. So